Judges, what are some of the weirdest cases you've seen? I used to be a probation agent. In this state, agents are Class 1 law enforcement, the same as game wardens and highway patrol. So as a probation agent, I worked in the courtroom a lot. The judges in the area all knew who I was and knew my name. There were two reasons we were ever in court, that is for violation hearings and pleas. For plea deals, the defendant is admitting he or she did something in exchange for a lighter sentence. There's a benefit for both the defendant and the state as well. But during the plea, the judge will craft a basic rundown of what he wants the probation to look like. He may want mental health screening or testing and rehab, that sort of thing. Now, the judge can alter or change any part of the supervision. The judge has a wide authority on this, and because of this wide authority, the judge might ask, Agent Citadel, if I order this, can you reasonably do it? So I'm always in court doing paperwork and ready to answer questions. The defendant doesn't always get probation, but I'm there during sentencing anyway. So long story short, this case revolves around a dad that had been mistreating his daughter for like 5 years, I think. So with sentencing, whenever there is a victim, the court always lets the victim give a statement. So basically, this victim gives the same rah, 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 I'm not scared of you and you can't hurt me anymore sort of response that we are so used to hearing. You'll hear this out of the most broken people imaginable. I think that this sort of statement must be an important part of healing, even if it isn't true at that point in time. So the victim gives her statement. The public defender says, Your Honor, can we put this behind us with offender probation and offender therapy? I see Agent Citadel over there. I know he's a good agent. My client would be in good hands with him. So the solicitor is standing there. She is a 6-foot-tall Polish woman with a slight accent. If she is anything, this woman is beautiful like polished steel. She is hard as nails. She moves cases. They call her the hammer. She, of course, asks for active time to be served concurrently. That means if the guy gets full time on all cases, he will do like whatever percent on whatever he gets sentenced to. Might end up being like 20 years. So the judge actually has a bad back. So this dude is tired of sitting, so he stands up and he says, Mister, I'm sure you've been hearing me give out probation all day today, and I'm sure you've seen Agent Citadel sign people up. Well, I'm here to tell you, I'm all out of probation. At this point, I raise an eyebrow and look at this judge. I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm about to see some real goddamn justice. And so he continues. He looks at the victim and he says, Young lady, what you said moved me. You said you're not scared today here in my courtroom. Young lady, I can't make sure you'll never be scared again in your lifetime, but I can't make sure that he will never scare you again. Miss, I'm going to make sure you never have to see him again unless you really want to. In the matter of, here he recites 4 different general session indictment numbers, I find you guilty on all counts and I'm sentencing you to the max on all counts, and they will be served consecutively, exactly as you mistreated this girl. Consecutively. Your crimes didn't happen all at once. You won't be able to pay for them all at once either. This guy got 124 years and will pass away in prison. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, and I hope that girl is doing okay. The defendant got a life sentence, but at least he's got plenty of time to reflect on his choices. Story 2. Not a judge or officer of the court, former journalist, sat through many trials back in the day, and there's a lot of weird things to go around. None was weirder than the trial of Ronald Gene Simmons. Simmons stood accused of ending 14 family members at his compound in Dover, AR, as they gathered to celebrate Christmas. Not included in this trial was the terminating of 2 and wounding of 4 others in Russellville, AR. Among them was his daughter and granddaughter, the same person, and his daughter, who was also the mother of the child. At this point, one can be forgiven for queuing up, I'm my own grandpa. Simmons was more than happy to admit guilt and accept the penalty, but at the time at least, the penalty required a trial with both a guilty and penalty phase. Simmons also didn't want legal representation, but that too was required for the penalty. The trial was largely pro forma, though the court-appointed attorney was actually quite skilled and did as good a job as circumstances allowed. After the state rested, Simmons insisted, over strenuous objections of counsel, to take the stand. He delivered a rambling tale drawing heavily on Ephesians and Leviticus, how, as head of household, it was his right to do as he wished. He wanted his daughter/wife to leave her legal husband and with his granddaughter/daughter to live together, as God intended, he said. When they didn't, he ended them and the rest of the family. Pretty open and shut, but the DA had to, in the unlikely case of appeal, establish that Simmons wasn't crazy and understood the full consequences of his actions. So on cross, the DA went at Gene hard on matters of man and God's law and his understanding of both. It was as effective as it was bizarre. It seems to have gotten under Simmons' skin a bit because, as the parties stood before the judge, dissing the schedule for the afternoon, Simmons just turned and knocked the DA in full view of the jury. The astute reader, by now, has probably figured the jury wasn't out long. The courthouse was one of those small rural buildings alone in a square in the center of town. The locals were driving around the square in trucks and cars shouting, "Burn him!" As the jury deliberated the penalty phase and other proceedings took place in the courtroom, the media and Simmons, handcuffed to the table, were kept in the same room in the basement, literally across the table from each other. We didn't talk, he just sort of occasionally stared at us, but most often just off into space. The table between us, was a box of donuts that once had a dozen, but only one, glazed with chocolate topping, remained. One of the hardest things in my journalism career was not looking at the criminal and asking him, "You gonna eat that?" It was a hell of an experience. Story 3. This isn't nearly as gnarly as other comments here, also not a lawyer. I supported a friend who had to go in and make a police report on our once trusted, long-standing, but now ex-friend. In short, while both girls were out, somehow my friend's pet ferret escaped her enclosure and attacked my ex-friend's guinea pigs who had to be put down. Now, this is all very sad. My friend was feeling awful and ready to apologize and pamper my ex-friend as much as she needed. Instead, the moment ex-friend got home, she heard her. My friend was shocked and terrified and ran to her room, but she kept going. My friend managed to lock ex-friend out, but then she picked up a sledgehammer, then a drill, threatening to harm her. With the help of mates, she escaped with a smashed phone but is now homeless. Ex-friend is an influencer with about 200K following of tweens. Got her mother and her army of fans to brigade against my friend and any of us who obviously sided with her for almost a year. Never apologized or owned up to anything all the way to court. As a first-time offender, she was only put on probation. Nonetheless, the police officer got a kick out of the absurdity of the story as the most bizarre thing he'd heard that day. Another bizarre thing was when filing the report, we realized that despite knowing her for 3 years, we didn't even know her last name. Apparently that didn't matter. The police officer got her name up near instantly as she was already on record for attempting to file a restraining order against a girl she didn't like for no reason. Ex-friend also doxed this girl's addresses online and she was getting threats and living in fear for months. We only found out all this later. I do wish I could have attended the hearing though. Story 4. Not a judge, but I was on a jury of a case that went on for 6 months, and at times it was an absolute circus. It was a fraud case, and only one man was on trial, but it was cleared to Blind Freddy. He was a part of a crime syndicate that tried to sell an office building they didn't own for $117 million. The case had been tried before, and there was a lot of handwritten evidence that both the prosecution and defense focused on to the point it felt like we were on Sesame Street some days. As we all would do was look at how curves were formed in certain letters. We had about 10 folders each, all to prove whether or not it was this guy's handwriting. Then a witness gets up who was clearly involved in the syndicate to rat this guy out and lie about having no involvement. And through good questioning, we learned he did 3 years in prison for fraud, had a bunch of items seized on his computer that were for no other reason than the fraudulent sale of an office building, but he maintained in court he had no involvement. You know you're a bad liar when a whole jury laughs at your stupidity. The biggest problem with the case, though, was the detective in charge was on stress leave and never gave any evidence, and the reason it dragged on for 6 months was it was clear the defense wanted to cause a mistrial and prolonged everything they could, constant excuses for breaks, and at one point had his words, not mine, a spontaneous nose injury to cause a break in proceedings. The thing was, their plan was working, and over the course of 6 months, we ended up going down to 9 jurors. I remember one juror got extremely ill and another had her wedding and were excused, but can't remember the reason for the other. But we were told if one more person had to leave the case, it would be declared a mistrial, and I could see the defense were hanging on that happening. It didn't happen, though. We came to a unanimous decision with 9 jurors and a verdict was given. Story 5. Obligatory, not a judge, but my step-grandfather was an Oregon Supreme Court justice. He'd retired long before I met him, so I never saw any of his cases in person. But he told me one particular story about a man who tried to represent himself in court. This young man, probably in his early 30s, comes into the courtroom wearing a military service uniform. This guy seems well-groomed, coherent, and capable. My grandfather served in the Air Force, and while he thought it odd someone would appear in court in uniform, he respected the dude. Military guy starts his defense but only gets a couple of sentences in before he holds up his arm and points to the service stripes saying, "And these are where I get my power from. All my energy comes from these stripes." Everyone starts looking around the room at each other as if silently asking, did you all hear that correctly? My grandpa asks him to clarify what he means, and he says the stripes are powerful and give him their energy so he can be powerful too. Grandpa stops the court proceedings and orders the guy to have a mental evaluation ASAP. He's immediately escorted out. The next day, my grandpa gets a knock at his office door. He opens it, and lo and behold, it's the same military dude from the previous day, wearing the same outfit. The dude's just standing there and grinning a really big, unsettling smile. Apparently, the psychiatrist determined he was of sound mind and wasn't a threat to himself or others, so let him go. My grandpa never told me when this story took place, but I'm assuming it happened before 72 hours holds were a thing. My grandfather just stood there, dumbfounded, before asking, anything I can do for you? The guy wanted to talk about his case and get the trial rescheduled, acting like nothing happened. Grandpa eventually convinced him to go talk to the receptionist instead. I don't know if there was a follow-up trial or what happened to the man or even if he was really in the military. Just a bizarre story about a guy who the mental health care system failed. Story 6. Obligatory, not a judge, but had my first argument before the Second Circuit, so obviously I was fairly nervous. The case before me had a very generic name, think Smith versus Generic Insurance Corp. Figured it was going to be dull. But instead, it turned out that the issue was that Mrs. Smith, a widow, had her husband's life insurance payment denied. Why? Husband was an engineer of some sort and had constructed a device to himself. He plugged said device into a wall socket on to enjoy on Easter Sunday while his family was out, but unfortunately was electrocuted and passed away, and presumably was found by his poor family on Easter. The insurer tried to deny benefits based on an exclusion for intentional self-harm. Cue a solid 20 minutes of the insurer's lawyer being grilled by very staid and conservative judges as to whether the poor guy actually intended to harm himself, or, as one judge put it very mildly, it seems the guy intended, well, the opposite. And the insurer lawyer is struggling to articulate why self-harm and pleasure are not always mutually exclusive. From the questions, it seemed like the widow was likely to win, but man, was that awkward for everyone involved. Story 7. Studied forensics, and a defense lawyer told me this story. He's called to defend a client who was accused of robbing a garage in a nearby city. Police found his fingerprints in a soda machine. Yes, in a soda machine. As in the disassembled vending machine, and dusted it and found a print on an internal component. Oh, here's the catch. The suspect was currently serving a prison sentence at the time of the crime. So this was the prosecutor's theory. Suspect had broken out of jail, drove 2 hours to that garage, burglarized it, opened up the soda machine, left his fingerprint inside it and nowhere else, reassembled it, drove back 2 hours, and snuck back in jail. Surprisingly, this case didn't get tossed out laughing and actually went to court. The good news for the suspect is that his lawyer discovered that before his incarceration, he happened to work for the business that maintained the soda machine, so he was trying to explain the fingerprint by saying it could have been left there when the suspect performed maintenance. He hired a fingerprint expert who was able to demonstrate that police used the wrong method for lifting a print. Story 8. I was a mediator in a small claims court in Queens, New York during law school. Mediators attempt to help the parties reach a settlement. A woman brought a claim against a shoe store. According to her, there was a display with shoes for $20. When she got to the register with 2 pairs of shoes, they charged her $25 per pair. She complained and told the counter person that they were on sale for $20. She brought the counter person to the display, and according to the woman, they had switched the sign so that now said $25. She paid the $50 and then sued for the $10 extra that she had to pay. The cost for filing the claim was $15. After she told me her story, I met with the 2 lower-level employees that the shoe store had sent to the court. They, of course, denied changing the sign, but I told them they can settle for $10 and leave immediately, or they would have to wait for a judge to decide the case. They happily paid $10. The woman lost $5 in the transaction. Story 9. Obviously not a judge, but I sat in on court proceedings once. An off-duty police officer was arrested for driving intoxicated in the city she worked in. The arguments made by her defense were incredible. First one was that no RN had taken the officers, which a hospital representative clarified this is normal. Reiterated that for something this simple, they can have residents/trainees do this as part of their learning. Second one was that the BAC content was higher because the drink was fermenting in the bag, that the exposure to air increased this process, thus raising the tested level, which was promptly shut down by an expert testifying that is not how it works, that alcohol doesn't continue to ferment and produce higher numbers from a sample over time. Finally, his last-ditch effort, he tried saying the sample was tampered with and or not tested correctly. There was a chain of custody provided and everything else that was needed to debunk this. The officer looked very defeated by the end of our sit-in. The judge basically had to tell the defense to put something better together. Finally, even the judge got tired of this see what sticks approach and shut it down. Flat out put the defense in his place for creating this mess. Story 10. Not a judge, brother-in-law was clerk at the court for most of a decade. Dude comes in with an indecent exposure charge. He was walking around the local Target in super shorty shorts, and his little shorty was longer than the shorts. Okay, this is supposedly a fairly straightforward slap on the wrist and get told to buy longer shorts, except it turns out that this isn't the guy's first rodeo. In fact, it's his 25th rodeo. Dude is an exhibitionist, and this was his MO. He was already banned from all retail establishments in half the counties in the state, and a handful of counties in the neighboring states. At this point, he'd had so many convictions that he was looking at 25 to life for exposure. Oddly enough, there was another indecent exposure case involving the other local Target a week later. Dude was standing up in the open bed of his pickup at 2 a.m., cranking it in the Target parking lot. Story 11. Not a judge. I was in court with my then GF for her DUI and her 2 cases before hers. The first was a woman who was charged with street working and argued that because it was for only $5, it wasn't really that if she was one, then she'd want more money. The next case was a series of guys that all pled guilty to illegal gambling. The cops were at an apartment complex for another call and saw a table with cards and money through a window, so being cops, busted a penny anti-poker game. The judge repeatedly asked each one of the gamblers if maybe the money had nothing to do with the game, and each defendant repeatedly insisted that they were gambling. The judge went so far as to suggest that maybe one player just owed money to the other players and was just trying to repay them. I'll never forget the defendant saying slowly, "No, sir, I didn't know him any money. I never borrow money. I was gambling and he won." The judge just sighed and fined them all several $100s for just being dumb. Turns out losing a few bucks at poker can be a lot more expensive than you'd think. Lesson learned, right? Story 12. I spent years as a court liaison of the Mental Health Authority, so I heard a lot of idiotic stuff. But my number one all-time fave was a guy charged with reckless driving, damage to property, and I don't remember what else. The main street of town was a major east-west U.S. route, so at times the traffic could get heavy. So the driver was headed west while receiving a whistle. His defense was that at the culmination of said activity, he inadvertently floored it and lost control of the vehicle, crashing into several places of business before coming to rest in the library. The judge was a total schmuck on the bench, but okay, as a person. He listened with what I can only describe as a bemused expression and waved his hand to signal that he had heard enough, then uttered this memorable verdict. "This is clearly a case of inappropriate driving rather than unpredictable driving, and I find the defendant not guilty." Then he tried to act angry when everybody laughed. Story 13. Not a judge, but in the U.S. Navy, I was a legal officer on a ship. My captain has the ability to administer punishment for violating military law. We had a sailor who broke the law, and after the captain found him guilty, the sailor said he would jump overboard. No one took him seriously, and sure enough, he went out to the weather deck and jumped right in the ocean. We had to recover him with one of our small boats, and he threatened to do it again, and he did it again a week later. Story 14. Well, I'm not a judge, but I was in traffic court once, and the following exchange happened. "So, Miss Defendant, you're here for a seat cushion violation. Is that even a thing?" "Apparently, Your Honor, the officer said I was too short." Long discussion with the state attorney and judge followed. They had white noise, but you could see the judge was clearly thinking this was an idiotic ticket. "How tall are you, miss?" "About 5 feet." "This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. Case dismissed." I looked it up later. There is a real restriction in Florida to say you need a raised seat if you are very short to see over the steering wheel, but this is presumably for people with dwarfism or such other conditions rather than petite women. Story 15. Not a judge, but I was going to court as a witness for my neighbor who was seeking a protection order. While we were there, we heard several other cases being heard. In one case, a man was accused of harming his daughter and dragging her out of the car. Mother of the child presents her case, and the judge turns to the father and gives him the opportunity to present his case and asks what happened on that day in the car. "Well, you see, the day before." "No, I want to hear what happened that day in the car." "My daughter has been getting B's in school, so." "No, what happened in the car?" "And she's been texting boys, so." "No." "She hit me first." He never really gave a straight answer, but the judge ruled against him. In the next case, there was a similar dynamic of separated parents arguing over a child, and there wasn't a lot of evidence of a physical danger, so the judge said a protection order wasn't necessary, and recommended they deal with it in family court. Guy from the first case was still around filling out paperwork and started cheering, and the bailiff told him to knock it off. Guy 1 says that he's from California and cheering is normal in court, and that this court is just prejudice. This guy was black, the judge was black, the bailiff was black, and pretty much most people on both sides of each case were black. And if you're getting a kick out of one of these stories so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 16. I was in court once, next up behind a guy on trial for a slew of charges. The dude told the judge, "If she's not of age to consent, how can her testimony be valid?" Judge proceeded to unload on this man and give him a chance to speak before she handed down a sentence. Dude said, word for word, "How are you going to treat her like an adult and me a criminal when I'm the one facing charges?" She proceeded to mess him up and he got like 20 life and I was next. Whizzed myself before I even stood up. Story 17. I'm not a judge, but a legal case involving alleged identical twins once landed on my desk. It somehow hinged on whether or not they were identical or just fraternal twins. They had an identical set of CODIS results. One party claimed that they were twins. The other party argued that it all demonstrated was that they were not excluded from being identical twins, so they might not actually be identical. Apparently, that was worth paying me reasonable amounts of money to demonstrate mathematically that if two siblings share 15 CODIS markers, they are identical twins with a certainty of greater than 99.99%, rather than just being fraternal or just siblings. I have no idea what that case was about or why that was such a controversial piece of evidence. Also, somewhat related, some years ago I saw this thing on TV, which was one of those gotcha segments, where journalists tried to expose people working at superettes who would take people's lottery tickets to check if they won, tell the customer they didn't, then try to claim the ticket themselves. Anyway, they waltz into the store, cameras rolling, and confront a young woman at the counter. "So, remember me, you stole my lotto ticket." She looks at him, confused. "No? Let me remind you," and then she shows her some footage of the sale. The girl goes, "That wasn't me, I didn't do it." And naturally, you think she's lying through her teeth, but actually, it was her evil twin who did it. Do not trust anyone, not even your own twin, evil or not. Story 18. Also not a judge, but I work with a psychologist who does some work in mental hospitals and has to testify as to whether they should or should not be released. Court is over the phone right now because of the virus, so I was privy to the little exchange. My boss's patient is schizophrenic and was refusing his medication. My boss was testifying as to why he shouldn't be released, violent to his family, active psychosis, much to the patient's displeasure. The patient starts yelling, "Man, I want to get out of here. It's so nasty. They got snakes in here." The judge replied, "Sir, the quickest way to get released is to comply with your medication, and the medication will also help you with your snake problem. Compliance is key. It might just banish those pesky snakes." Story 19. Not a judge. My father worked court services as a police officer and came home and told me about the case. We had a few very rural areas around where I lived. The case was brought because the daughter had reported to a friend that her dad and two brothers had taken her out to the woods and did things with her. While the judge was trying to explain to the father why this is wrong, he replied, "Well, how else is she supposed to learn from a stranger? I don't think I've ever seen my father drink as much as he did that night." This happened in Canada, not in the US. I have a lot of very horrifying things from my dad about what he saw while on duty, and I have no idea how he dealt with it as well as he did. Story 20. Worked in LE for a long while, escorted an inmate to court for his crimes and charges trial. He chose to represent himself. Context. Was infatuated with Charles Manson and cults. Started one that preyed on mentally unstable/handicapped women and ended them if they try to leave. This poor girl with autism wanted to go home. He ended her with his followers as help. His opening statement was something along the lines of, "Ladies and gentlemen of court, I just want to clarify that things are going to come up in this trial." The judge said, "What the hell?" but caught himself before dropping the F-bomb. Everyone in the courtroom laughed at him. It was thrown out and he went for mental health screenings. I don't miss LE work at all. I did accrue a ton of stories, though. Story 21. I went to court for a traffic ticket in the state of Mississippi. I was working on a project out there, and what I found weird is the judge's ruling on two different cases. First was a woman who wrecked her car, had a child not in a baby car seat, DUI, and possession of a controlled substance. He gave her a year's probation, no jail time. Next was a lady whose son had been skipping school and missed X amount of days, something like 34 days. He put the mother in cuffs right then and there and ordered her to spend the same amount of days in jail that she had allowed her son to miss school. I didn't say anything, but I'm pretty sure the look on my face was, "What the heck?" Story 22. I'm a lawyer considering whether to someday be a judge. The toy bomber was the oddest case I've worked on so far. Boyfriend gets dumped in spring, stalks ex-girlfriend for 9 months. He's known to have an obsessive interest in bombs and explosives and is a significant user. In December, he delivered a package to ex-girlfriend. There's no return address, but it says, "Merry Xmas, Witch," so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out who sent it. X calls the cops, who call the bomb squad, who open the package. Inside is a large toy that's been hollowed out and filled with explosives. He apparently assumed that she would eagerly use it and blow herself up, and this is how you know that men and women think differently. Story 23. Okay, I'm not a judge, but years ago, I used to process court transcripts. I often would read them because some were really crazy, especially older ones because times were just different back then. Anyways, there was one dated around 1940. It was a man divorcing his wife. After the divorce was final, he sued her for mental distress and anguish because apparently her cat stunk really bad. And because of it, he didn't want to have intimacy with her, and it caused him to feel like less of a man because he wasn't having it as much as he thought he should. He won the case, got custody of their child, and she was ordered to pay a decent amount of money to him. Also, the judge urged her to go to the doctor and get help for her smelly cat because until she did, she would likely never find another man or be happy in life. LOL, can you imagine that happening today? Thank God things are changing. That poor lady. Story 24. Not a judge, but I am an attorney now. Back when I was doing my whole internship shtick, I worked at a mental health courthouse. When I finished my usual routine, I would be allowed to sit at hearings with the clerk of the court, and I sat in one particularly odd case where the accused went through an elaborate setup with his ex-GF and her family for a Thanksgiving dinner. Long story short, dude was off of his meds. He convinced his ex-GF and family over for Thanksgiving dinner after he had gone off on a tangent on them, which caused a breakup. After Thanksgiving, the dude texted the ex and her family pictures of his Johnson and all of the food they had eaten the day before. I was like, well, he certainly stuffed that turkey. Story 25. Friend is a judge. Weirdest case was a dispute between neighbors wherein two parties accused their female neighbor of being a witch. Case was initially brought up relating to charges of stolen property, criminal damage, and burglary. The accused was alleged to have stolen from the neighbors' gardens and outhouses, with the abuse pertaining to the passing of several livestock, multiple chickens and a goat. Said case was weird overall, particularly when the two parties made claims that the neighbor was casting harmful spells on them, danced in the moonlight, and chanted into the early morning. All charges were proven to be true based on physical and recorded evidence. Story 26. A little late to the show, and not a judge, but here's my strange court-related incident. I was in court for a dog without a leash citation, and to start things off, the judge quieted the room for briefing. She does her spiel, and directly after the bailiff walks from the rear of the courtroom up to the bench, leans in to whisper something and hands her an object. The judge's face turns towards us and asks the bailiff, "Where is he? Please come to the stand." As the gentleman approaches, the sounds of a video start playing from the phone that the bailiff handed the judge. "You have the audacity to watch that in my courtroom while I'm briefing everyone? I can't believe this. This is a first," proclaimed the judge. I don't quite remember what the charges against the video watcher were initially, but the judge added 72 hours for contempt of court. Story 27. Not a judge, also not me. So this lady made Easter decorations to be displayed on the door of her apartment. The display included Peeps, marshmallow candy shaped like ducklings in case you're unfamiliar. The apartment complex tried to evict her on the basis that the candy in the display made it unsanitary. So the courts call in a local Peeps expert, a weird but super rad dude named Andrew Novick. Every year, he hosts a Peep-themed barbecue for his community, and apparently the lawyers thought that made him an expert regarding that particular snack. I regret that I don't know the outcome of the case or what Peep-specific questions were involved. All I remember is Andrew recounting the story as one of the weirdest experiences of his life. It doesn't sound like a huge claim, but coming from a guy who has been featured in the local art museum for his collection of collections, and who was a lead singer of an 80s punk band obsessed with bubble stripes gum, something being his weirdest experience carries some weight. Also, Andrew, if you see this, I miss working with you and listening to your stories. Story 28. Not a judge, but have spent an extensive amount of time in court and incarcerated. I was due to be sentenced on my second breaking and entering charge. A man from the public was getting sentenced before me. He was charged with repeatedly mistreating his grandson when he would watch him. Before he was sentenced, the judge asked the probation for their sentencing guidelines, which they responded with no jail time. 5 years probation. I was in disbelief that this was even a consideration. He ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison for what he did to his grandson on multiple occasions. I was then sentenced after. Probation recommended for my second charge ever, stemming from my habits. 4 years with 3 years parole, which I got. It was such a weird contrast in cases, and I can't believe a person could even weigh our cases in such a way. Story 29. Here in Canada, we have a law that states you are not guilty with reasonable doubt. Well, an intoxicated driver ended 2 people in a major accident and rolled his truck over. The prosecution stated that the driver failed a sobriety test, walking on the line test. The defense argued that he was in shock from the crash and didn't prove he was intoxicated. After the crash, he was taken to the hospital and given a test for the possible DUI. The prosecution said that the level was way above the legal limit. The defense had the nurse who took the test and asked what she used to rub the area to insert the needle. She said she doesn't remember, and the intoxicated driver was scot-free afterwards, and the case was thrown out. Story 30. Not a judge, but I was once given the opportunity to show up in another district, about 5 hours of public transport away, to defend and deny a traffic ticket. I was charged with talking on the phone while driving, and I did not agree to that charge as I was parked, handbrake pulled but engine on, idling. Pro tip, always turn off your vehicle if parked, especially in a crowded place. I was in a very crowded place, a drop-off at a huge festival. My transport expenses would not be covered, and because I was a student, I could seek a 50% reduction on the fine. I decided it would not be worth it bickering over some wording that I didn't agree to, especially because I totally was talking on the phone with the engine running, which I learned by definition counts as driving. Story 31. My father was a circuit court judge for a number of years. He used to tell me all kinds of stories, but my favorite was from a divorce dispute. The 2 sons of the husband and wife were messing around and they made a hole in the wall. The father was upset, so he grabbed a hammer and put a bunch of holes into the wall to prove to the boys how bad the holes look. I don't remember the exact number, but it was around 90. When the attorney for the wife asked him if it was a good idea, the husband said, "Well, in hindsight, I guess maybe not." My father said that's the only time that he's ever almost burst out laughing in court. Story 32. Not a judge, but this thread is reminding me of when I volunteered to help people in New Orleans expunge their criminal records. People came in all day asking if they were eligible, and we had to check the system to see what was on their record, then help them start the process, if so. Mostly, it was minor offenses. This one wiry, apologetic-looking guy walks in and gives me his info. I pulled up his record to see that he was convicted of a felony. I apologized profusely and told him it couldn't be expunged, trying my best to hide my nervous shaking. He nodded and left. Haven't thought about that until now, many years later. I didn't know how to react at the time. Looking back on it now, I can't believe the guy had the nerve. Story 33. My ex, forgot to lie in court. Not a judge, but fully 2 years after we dated. An ex got a restraining order on me as revenge for saying her tattoos were bad. She claimed I had stalked her and threatened her. We go to court, she tells her side, the judge picks at a couple holes in her story, then asks her, per the law on restraining orders, how she feels I am a threat to her safety, security, and privacy. The only thing she had to say, nobody should be able to say that about my tattoos. She gave something like 7 pages of written allegations and 30 minutes of opening testimony, declaring me a crazed and dangerous lunatic. And then right when it counted, all she could remember was the time I linked on her own comment in an Ask Reddit thread in another Ask Reddit thread. I guess it was too much effort to live a lie. Of course, she started out by forgetting that a restraining order requires actual evidence, so it wasn't great for her case that she openly stated that I had avoided all contact with her for the last 2 years, despite having recently seen each other at a show, and even having been out of state during that period, not mentioned by her. The time when I had contacted her during that period to confront her for stalking me online. Also, if you feel that your privacy has been violated by mocking your tattoos, and you want to make fake claims of stalking, make sure that the date of those false allegations is not a day that you texted to confirm that you had correctly stalked my whereabouts, then spent the rest of the week texting and sending pics, because that will go to the public record. When I asked at the free legal clinic if the judge would rather censor the photos in my exhibits, or if it would be better to leave them as is, the female lawyer helping me responded, "She sent you those?" and busted a gut laughing. Story 34. Not a lawyer or a judge. My dad's friend was driving while intoxicated just over the limit, and so he denied the breathalyzer and wanted a test, and is busting the cops as they bring him into the station. Then they try to breathalyze him again, and he says it's unconstitutional, and after 10 minutes of his tirade, The cops just say, "Why don't you call your lawyer and have him cooperate that?" Guy calls the lawyer, and the lawyer says, "It's 3 a.m., get locked up, and I'll come down tomorrow." Tells the cops he's on his way and he's furious. He keeps that narrative going for 4 hours, and after a while, the breathalyzer test can't be used against you. So they just told him to leave, unimpounded his vehicle, then went home. Just found it the funniest law skirt ever. Story 35. Not a judge, but was a mess up when I was younger. Went to court one day with a warrant for FTA. Knew I would be arrested at court, and when 2 officers came in, I knew they were there for me. Surprisingly, they pick up the guy sitting directly in front of me, telling him, "Rocket Mountain Gamer, you have a warrant for FTA, you need to come with us." Guy starts vehemently denying it, but they are not buying it, and the whole time I'm laughing inside my head and wondering how far I should let this go. As they start walking him out of the courtroom, I ask them if they're sure they got the right person, and then when they take a second look and get a good look at me, they finally realize they had messed up. They had a picture of me, a description, 6'3" white guy versus 5'8" Hispanic guy. I would have taken that guy to booking before realizing their mistake if I hadn't spoken up. Story 36. Not a judge, but when I was in college, I was a TA for a criminology class, and one assignment was having the students attend a court case and write a report on it. One student paper I graded mentioned a trial where a family was suing a Bennigan's restaurant because they served hot chocolate to a 5-year-old that had alcohol in it. The kid got intoxicated and they had to take him to a hospital. Must have been an amusing case for the judge there. Story 37. There was an area in town known for teen cruising, kids driving around in circles, honking, mostly on weekend nights. There were no cruising signs all around. Anyway, my friend, an adult woman in her 30s with her 2-year-old in the car, was in that area. She missed the turn-off for the store she wanted and had to loop around. This is a weekday, the middle of the day. Dumbest ever cop pulled her over and actually gave her a ticket for cruising. Bizarrely, she had to pay the fine. Story 38. Today, a man hired a lawyer to dispute $170 in court fees in a small claims case. The case was for some work the plaintiff had done, and upon being served, the defendant paid him, which is an obvious admission of guilt. Then upon the initial hearing was shocked to hear that he had admitted guilt in this way and still owed court fees for forcing the plaintiff to have to pay to file and serve him in the first place. So he has now lawyered up to screw his ex-employee out of $170. And if you liked any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.